Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Views of an Outsider, the Outsider's View from April 26th. If you want to keep up with everything that's going on in the world, but you don't want to drag down your entire life by listening to the news every day, then get the main stories right here once a week, and spend the rest of your time actually living your best life. Let's get right into it. Let's kick things off right with an uplifting story. The brave high school principal here in Oklahoma who tackled a would-be school shooter was crowned prom king by his grateful students last weekend. Principal Kirk Moore risked it all to save the students that were in his care at Pauls Valley High School. Thanks to his actions, no students were actually harmed, and his students appreciated the man who took a bullet for them. Video footage of Principal Moore being honored by them last Friday night has been spreading smiles all across social media this week. In that video, an announcer at the prom can be heard saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, our king, Kirk Moore." As students erupted into cheers and began giving him high fives, the DJ began blasting the Nickelback song, "Hero." As Principal Moore's crown was placed on his head, the song's chorus could be heard singing out the words, "And they say that a hero can save us. I'm not going to stand here and wait." If you haven't heard the story yet, here's what happened on April 7th. A former Pauls Valley High School student, 20-year-old Victor Hawkins, pointed a gun at a nearby student as he invaded the school, and he did pull the trigger. But his firearm malfunctioned, saving that student's life. The shooter ducked behind a nearby vending machine in order to clear the jam in his gun. When he stepped out again, he actually fired a shot at another student, but the bitch missed. Hearing the gunfire, Principal Moore charged out of his office as Hawkins fired again. The principal barreled into the shooter, knocking him onto a bench, where he wrestled the gun away from him, which is how he came to be shot in the leg. Kirk Moore and his assistant principal restrained Hawkins by lying on top of him, keeping him that way until law enforcement arrived. Pauls Valley Police Chief Don May told NBC News, "There's not a doubt in my mind that he saved kids' lives." Hawkins later stated that he had intended to kill Principal Moore specifically, and that he had done what he had done because he, quote, "wanted to conduct his own school shooting like the Columbine shooters did." Why not just tattoo the word loser across your forehead instead? Ultimately, Loser Boy failed, but Oklahoma has a consolation prize waiting for him, as many years of hard time in prison as the law will allow us to sentence you to. So enjoy the Shawshank experience on us, son. But he was not the only blood-obsessed killer that was put behind bars. At the Los Angeles International Airport, federal agents moved in on a 44-year-old Iranian national, Shamim Mafi, and those agents arrested her just as she was preparing to board a flight out of this country. Prosecutors say that this arrest was the takedown of a terrorist-tied individual who was operating as the middleman in a massive weapons pipeline that is tied to Iran. According to an unsealed federal complaint, Mafi has been officially accused of brokering deals for Iranian-made military equipment, including drones, bombs, and the specialized components that are used in explosives. Investigators also made it clear that the scope of this operation was not a small one. Some of the alleged transactions involved tens of millions of rounds of ammunition, with multiple deals being set in motion at one time. This was a massive terrorist weapons pipeline that was functioning on our own soil. One of the more striking incidents in this case centers on a proposed agreement for armed drone systems known as Mohajir 6 that were intended for Sudan's Ministry of Defense. That illegal deal alone was valued at more than $70 million. On top of that weapons deal, authorities allege that this Iranian national worked to arrange the transfer of tens of thousands of bomb fuses, and she helped to facilitate ammunition shipments that included at least 10 million rounds, with even larger quantities than that being discussed as part of separate negotiations. This was all being coordinated from inside the United States by a citizen of Iran. And Mafi, as an Iranian citizen, has been allowed to live here for years as a lawful permanent resident, a status that she was granted back in 2016, a decade ago. Authorities released this information to the public, telling them that this terrorist maintained a home in Woodland Hills, California, and that she frequently traveled to red flag countries like Iran, Turkey, and Oman. Investigators believe those international connections were key to the functioning of this weapons pipeline operation. According to the complaint, Mafi allegedly used a business that was based in Oman to move the illicit weapons deals forward. And then she routed the payments from the terrorist recipients through countries like Turkey and the United Arab Emirates. Prosecutors say that structure was designed to avoid detection and dodge U.S. sanctions on these kinds of illegal interactions. Federal investigators also claimed that Mafi was in contact with several individuals that are involved in Iran's intelligence apparatus, meaning they were official Iranian spies. The court documents allege repeated communications with an officer at Iran's Ministry of Intelligence and Security. This contact continued, spanning many years, and dozens of those interactions are documented through phone records. In interviews, Mafi allegedly acknowledged these connections, and at one point, she even tried to save herself by suggesting that she was more valuable to them in Iran than here in the United States. So take note, Iran, when we send her back to you, she offered to sell you out. But I don't think so, sweetie. We got you, and now we're going to keep you. Just be grateful that unlike your country, we no longer hang hostile spies. We have her in custody because agents stepped in before she could leave our country, taking her into custody at LAX as she prepared to fly to Turkey. She now faces federal charges for violating U.S. sanctioned laws, including brokering illicit weapons deals involving Iranian-made military equipment without the required licenses to do so. If convicted, she could face up to 20 years in prison, and after which point she needs to be deported back to the country where they are welcome to hang her for failing them, as far as I'm concerned. But aside from this one woman, who was foolishly taken in from a very high-risk area of the world, the same woman whose constant travel to other high-risk areas of the world, overrun with blood-obsessed terrorists, all of which was ignored. Aside from all of that, this case is already raising broader questions. This incident highlights exactly how complex international networks can operate between multiple countries while managing to maintain a presence inside the United States via one of their terrorist agents. It also underscores the ongoing challenge that federal authorities face in trying to track and stop these kinds of operations before they move from being behind-the-scenes deals into real-world, very bloody consequences. Something that will happen, especially if we insist on being stupid about who we take in, and we continue to pretend to be blind about knowing what we know about certain parts of the world. And as we continue to insist on pretending that they are all the same when they are demonstrably not. But we sadly were not done for the week when it came to criminals with deadly weapons. Last Saturday night, a gunman who appeared to be targeting his own offspring opened fire in 3 different homes across the city of Shreveport, Louisiana. And the shooter was shot and killed after he attempted to carjack a vehicle in order to escape. The apparent perpetrator of this horrific murder spree was identified later that day as being the 31-year-old United States Army veteran Shamar Elkins. According to a Sunday report by the New York Post, Elkins shot 10 people, 8 of whom died. The 2 survivors were both adult women, and all 8 of the murder victims were children, ranging in age from 1-year-old to 14 years old at the oldest. 7 of these children were apparently the shooter's own kids. During a press conference, a spokesperson for the Shreveport Police Department, Christopher Bordelon, said that Elkins perpetrated a carjacking and fled, leading to a chase by Shreveport police officers, and ultimately the suspect was shot and killed by police. One less monster in the world. And before you get upset with me for calling him a monster, what would you call someone who puts a pistol to the head of his own 1-year-old baby and pulls the trigger? There isn't another word for it. The local police chief, Wayne Smith, noted that the large crime scene that was left behind included the scene of the carjacking, in addition to the 3 homes full of dead children, saying, "This is an extensive scene unlike anything most of us have ever seen." Mayor Tom Arcano added, "This is a tragic situation, maybe the worst tragic situation we've ever had in Shreveport. So right now, we're going to process the information, and it's in very good hands. It's a terrible warning." In the meantime, there was no known motive announced for the massacre, although several reports indicated that the suspect was involved with one of the women that he shot. One thing was clear. This killer was not unknown to the criminal justice system. Yet instead of pointing fingers at the permissive judges who let him off light for his previous crimes, the irresponsible judges who put him back on the street where he massacred 8 small children, a writer for New York Magazine had a brilliant theory on who was to blame. She decided to blame the patriarchy. Based on absolutely zero evidence, zilch, none, nada, just a baseless idea that she liked because it fit her worldview. If you contorted the facts of the situation into a pretzel, this so-called writer desperately tried to twist the narrative to somehow comply with a preconceived ideological conclusion. Brittany Cooper wrote that this terrible shooting was due to the manosphere, even though she had no evidence at all that this shooter even watched that kind of content. She also blamed the massacre on a, quote, nation being led by a group of right-wing extremists with Neanderthal ideas about gender and sexuality. She also offered no proof for that claim, the one that says that the country is being led by extremists or by people who have an inaccurate conception of sex. Nevertheless, she needed no evidence for groundless claims that are this stupid and made in religious devotion to a false catechism, and therefore she declared, quote, "These killings are the natural outcome of a country enamored with patriarchy and determined to make sure that men can freely dominate women," end quote. The polls do not back her up on this. The vast majority of people in this country do not support that idea at all. So this is clearly another person who cannot tell the difference between the reality that she actually lives in and the one that she sees on TV when she watches The Handmaid's Tale, a fictional series. She was probably also one of the people who were promoting adolescence like it was a documentary instead of another fictional series. So, here's a fact for you, sweetie. Facts being things that reflect the reality of this dimension. The number of incel murders worldwide, if you go with the highest number that is available and assume that the highest number is the most accurate one, there have been 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 worldwide. That doesn't sound like an ideology that is shared by an entire nation of millions of people. At least not to those of us who can distinguish between fiction and reality. Readers on social media pushed back strongly against this transparently self-serving and utterly groundless theory. One sarcastic commenter wrote, "Well, you couldn't make it about racism, so I guess patriarchy seemed like a good idea. Though I bet if you tried, you could make it about racism and how mostly female mental health professionals won't take on poor black male clients. Of course, then, no patriarchy. Tough one." Another commenter added, "The race is inconvenient, so we switched to a gender motive. He was a criminal, a gun criminal, no less. But instead of being locked up, the same people that screech constantly about gun violence went easy on him, as they always do. It's a story about leftist policies causing more death." According to USA Today, Elkins shot the mother of his children and another woman, as well as his 7 children and one of their cousins. They noted that Elkins had married Shaniqua Pugh in April of 2024. A woman named Christina Snow sued Elkins for child support and was granted joint custody of their child, Soraya, in 2017. Soraya was sadly one of the victims of this shooting. Sadly, other parents were grieving this week as well. On Monday morning, Senator Mark Warner, who was once the governor of Virginia in the early 2000s and who has served in the Senate ever since 2009, the senator and his wife, Lisa Collins, announced the tragic news that their daughter had died after a long battle with diabetes, saying in a statement, "We are heartbroken beyond words by the passing of our beloved daughter, Madison, 36, after a decades-long battle with juvenile diabetes and other health issues. She filled our lives with love and laughter, and her absence leaves an immeasurable void. We are grateful for the loving support of friends and family during this difficult time and ask for privacy as we navigate this profound loss." Hundreds of comments and tributes flooded social media after that announcement, offering condolences to the Warner family, including posts from voices on both sides of the aisle, as is only right and human in the face of profound tragedy. Republican Representative Nancy Mace posted, "Our deepest condolences. We're keeping your family in our prayers." The Democrat former Representative Elaine Luria wrote, "I am so sorry to hear of Madison's passing. Please join me in praying for Senator Warner, Lisa, and their family, and everyone who knew and loved Madison." Republican Senator Mike Lee added, "Please join me in praying for Senator Warner, his wife Lisa, and all their family and friends mourning today." State-level voices in Virginia also expressed condolences on Madison's death. The Democrat Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, Ghazala Hashmi, posted, "Azar and I are simply heartbroken to learn of Madison Warner's passing. We are keeping Mark, Lisa, and all who love Madison in our prayers, and we hope that the love surrounding the Warner Collis family and the memories of Madison bring comfort in these difficult days." Diabetes is the 7th leading cause of death in the United States, with over 94,000 deaths that are related to this condition occurring just in 2024 alone. That is according to the Centers for Disease Control. Senator Warner and his wife have 2 other daughters, and 2 grandchildren, according to his official website. This seemed to be a week of repeating themes, and we weren't done on the spy front yet. Earlier this month, U.S. authorities arrested a Chinese national at JFK International Airport in New York City. He was accused of traveling to Nebraska and taking photographs of important military aircraft near the Offutt Air Force Base. According to reports from Fox News, Tianrui Lang also allegedly planned to travel to Oklahoma to photograph more military aircraft at Tinker Air Force Base. According to court documents, this 21-year-old Chinese national is now charged with violating United States law, which prohibits all people from photographing or sketching defense installations. Here's what happened. According to an FBI affidavit, authorities were first alerted about this spy's suspicious activity near the Offutt Air Force Base after a person witnessed a male holding a camera with a telescopic lens near the military installation. Offutt Air Force Base is one of the most sensitive military sites in the entire United States. It is the home of U.S. Strategic Command, which is responsible for nuclear defense and global strike operations. The base also hosts some of the United States military's most powerful reconnaissance aircraft, including the E-4B Night Watch, which is also known as the Doomsday Plane, which is designated for military leaders or for the president to use in case of a nuclear war. Yang was charged in Nebraska on April 3rd and was arrested at JFK International Airport 4 days later. He was taken into custody just before he was about to board a plane for Frankfurt, Germany, after which he planned to fly to Glasgow, Scotland, according to court documents. This Chinese spy was in the United States on a non-immigrant B-1, B-2 visa, which authorizes temporary travel for tourists or foreigners that are on business trips or visiting family members. Multiple Chinese nationals have been arrested in recent years for taking pictures at U.S. military bases. In August of 2023, 5 Chinese nationals, all former students at the University of Michigan, were caught taking pictures of military equipment during joint training exercises between the National Guard and the Taiwanese military at Camp Grayling in northern Michigan. Last December, a Chinese national was arrested for taking videos of B-2 Spirit stealth bombers at Whitman Air Force Base in Missouri. He also took numerous photos of military equipment and photographed the perimeter fencing around the base, according to the Department of Justice. There have also been major concerns raised over the extremely localized interest from citizens of China when it comes to buying up the land all around major military bases, purchases which have been quite extensive and quite localized to only these areas. We cannot afford to keep being this stupid and this willfully blind about admitting that we are seeing what we are seeing, or we are going to pay for that stubborn stupidity in blood. That is the way of the world. And speaking of one of those willful blind spots where there is plenty to see if you don't close your eyes deliberately for ideological reasons, midweek, the Daily Wire reported that an illegal foreign national, one who has been in this country ever since 2006, now stands accused of persistently sexually abusing his own underage daughter for several years, which just led to her giving birth in the parking lot of a South Carolina hospital earlier this month. This perverted abuser is a Mexican national, 43-year-old Luis Armando Argusta Montero. According to WYFF, he was arrested and charged with 3 counts of second-degree criminal sexual misconduct with a minor and 1 count of incest after the poor young girl gave birth on April 11th in Oconee County. WSAZ reported that investigators clearly stated that her own father, Monteiro, engaged in sexual intercourse with the victim starting when she was 11 years old, which would have been in 2022. And he continued raping her at least up through 2025, when she would have been just 14. According to WIFF, the arrest warrants identify Monteiro as the biological father of the juvenile victim that he apparently impregnated. According to People magazine, deputies were alerted to the criminal situation after this poor child gave birth. The case was then turned over to the Violent Crimes Unit of the Criminal Investigation Bureau, and under their investigation, the results were that Monteiro was arrested on April 16th. The victim and her baby were subsequently placed into protective custody. The Department of Homeland Security told the Daily Wire that ICE lodged a detainer on April 17th, and they expect that local authorities will comply with it and hand this incest-committing pervert, baby rapist over to federal immigration agents for deportation out of here. His own country can deal with him after that. The Assistant Secretary for the Department of Homeland Security, Lauren Biss, correctly stated that this sicko should never have been in our country to prey on children in the first place. He now faces charges for incest and multiple child sex crimes. Under Secretary Mullen, ICE lodged an arrest detainer with South Carolina to ensure this monster is never loose in our communities again. Thankfully, South Carolina cooperates with ICE law enforcement. This is why we need cooperation from state and local partners, so together we can keep criminals off our streets and make America safe again. Representative Sherry Biggs of South Carolina called Monteiro and his alleged crimes the worst of the worst, adding that they are the kind of crimes that are truly sickening and evil. She concluded by saying, "I thank ICE for their quick action, and I pray nothing like this ever happens again." According to multiple reports, Monteiro is being held on an $80,000 bond. And according to DHS, aside from his illegal entry into our country, this citizen of Mexico has no previous criminal history inside the United States. So much for the argument that a U.S. criminal record should be the only factor in these cases. Tell that to the girl that he raped and impregnated. So, what were all of the elected leaders of our country doing to grab the wheel so that the ship is actually steered instead of just smashing against the rocks as they bicker over their own opposing religious beliefs, the ones that we now euphemistically call ideologies? Well, I'll tell you. On Tuesday, the Democrat representative Sheila Shirphyllis McCormick of Florida resigned from Congress just hours before the House Ethics Committee was set to issue a recommendation on whether she should be expelled from our body of lawmakers. Her resignation took effect immediately. It is the result of a bipartisan ethics panel finding that Shirphyllis McCormick committed 25 ethics violations, including breaking campaign finance laws. In November of 2025, the Department of Justice indicted the Congresswoman for stealing $5 million in federal disaster relief funds, and she stole this from disaster victims in order to finance her own campaign. So what did she have to say for herself? In a statement, Sir Phyllis McCormick said, "This was not a fair process. The Ethics Committee refused my new attorney's reasonable request for time to prepare my defense by going forward with this process while a criminal indictment is pending. The committee prevented me from defending myself. I will not stand by and pretend this has been anything other than a witch hunt." Way to step up and take responsibility for your own wrongdoing. Blame them for the fact that your attorney-switching delay tactics got you nowhere. Sir Phyllis McCormick, having resigned, which is practically an admission of her guilt, is now the third House member to resign just since April 13th. The Democrat former Representative Eric Swalwell and the Republican former Representative Tony Gonzalez of Texas both resigned following sexual and misconduct scandals. It's time to re-embrace this wonderful thing that we used to call standards, people. Politicians are not entertainers. Entertainers are entertainers. Politicians need to be able to run the ship and do it well enough that you can forget they're even around. So, was that at least the end of this week's scandals? Oh, not even close. In a bombshell grand jury indictment that was issued by the Justice Department on Tuesday, the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is a far-left extremist group that supposedly exists to oppose hate groups, yet they were exposed this week for secretly giving millions of dollars in funding to white supremacist groups. Late on Tuesday, officials announced that the SPLC was indicted by a grand jury on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy to commit money laundering over its informant practices. To be specific, that indictment asserted that the SPLC had, quote, secretly funneled more than $3 million in funds to white supremacists and extremist groups. The indictment revealed that this money went to various hate groups, including Aryan nations, members of the Ku Klux Klan, and a member of Unite the Right, the group that infamously staged the pro-Nazi march in Charlottesville, Virginia. Todd Blanche, the acting Attorney General, stated that the indictment lays out how the SPLC claimed to be working towards dismantling these groups, while in reality it was doing the exact opposite and funding them, presumably to keep themselves in business and their out-of-date narratives in the headlines. Of the Southern Poverty Law Center itself, he bluntly said that it was instead manufacturing the extremism it purports to oppose by paying sources to stoke racial hatred. Now, prosecutors have charged the SPLC with 11 different counts of wire fraud, false statements to a federally insured bank, and conspiracy to conceal money laundering. The director of the FBI, Kash Patel, echoed Attorney General Blanche in saying that the SPLC was using funds from trusting donors with presumably good intentions to fund the very groups that it told those donors it was using their money to combat, stating they used their donor network to raise money to purportedly dismantle violent extremist groups. However, the SPLC, the Southern Poverty Law Center, used the money they raised from their donor network to actually pay the leadership of these very groups. The Southern Poverty Law Center is a very well-known, major non-profit organization that is based in Montgomery, Alabama. It describes itself very nobly as being a, quote, catalyst for racial justice in the South and beyond, working in partnership with communities to dismantle white supremacy, strengthen intersectional movements, and advance the human rights of all people. In actuality, The SPLC is a partisan organization that manipulatively labels its own political opponents as racists, while funding the most notorious true racist in the entire country. The Southern Poverty Law Center's so-called hate map notoriously put simple, conservative, parental rights groups like Moms for Liberty alongside hate groups like the Ku Klux Klan, claiming they were the same. The Ku Klux Klan being a group that they now stand accused of actually funding. Under Kash Patel, the FBI cut ties completely with the SPLC late last year, and during Tuesday's press conference, they disclosed that the investigation into that group was still ongoing, so even more shockers may still be uncovered before we are done excavating the sewage that has been produced by this group. As to the outcomes of this incredibly low corruption of funding real hate groups, it turns out, according to the Justice Department, that an informant who was one of the people that was paid by the Southern Poverty Law Center helped white supremacists plan the infamous Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017. There was apparently nothing organic about that disgusting event, but there is a whole lot of organic irony going on, because one of the SPLC's paid informants was a member of the leadership team of the white supremacist group that planned the rally in Charlottesville. That informant, who was identified in the indictment as Field Source 37, or F-37 for short, was paid more than $270,000 by the SPLC between 2015 and 2023. That same informant was part of a group chat that was created for the people who were planning the Unite the Right rally. And that same paid informant actually attended and participated in that racist rally, quote, at the direction of the SPLC, according to the Justice Department. The indictment against the Southern Poverty Law Center states that F-37 made racist postings under the supervision of the SPLC and helped coordinate transportation to the event for several attendees. To recap, the 2017 Unite the Right rally included a mix of alt-right groups, including neo-Nazis and actual Klansmen. The rally turned deadly when a man drove his car through a crowd of counter-protesters, killing a 32-year-old woman and injuring 35 other people. That rally and the violence that ensued became a main talking point for Democrats, who now had an excuse to blame Republicans and President Trump for the racism in this country. But the call was coming from inside the House, because it turns out that they funded and organized the whole thing. Joe Biden pointed to Charlottesville as the main reason that he decided to jump into the 2020 presidential race, saying in his campaign announcement video, quote, "In that moment, I knew the threat to this nation was unlike anything I had ever seen in my lifetime." Yeah, you can say that again. The threat from your side. Because apparently there really is no line that you won't cross to get more money and more power for yourselves, including funding the handful of actual white supremacists that still exist in this country. The indictment that was announced by the Justice Department this week provides multiple additional examples of how the Southern Poverty Law Center has been paying informants that are affiliated with extremist groups, stating that these racists were paid more than $3 million by the nonprofit between 2014 and 2023, paid to be racists and to stir up racism in others. The SPLC is also accused of hiding its deplorable activity behind bank accounts that were opened for a series of fictitious entities, and making false statements about the bank accounts to keep the hate operation going. Another Southern Poverty Law Center informant, F9, helped fundraise for the neo-Nazi group National Alliance. For his racist work on their behalf, F9 raked in more than $1 million from the SPLC over a 20-year period. That's according to the indictment. Another informant, F30, was secretly paid around $70,000 by the SPLC during a time when that same informant was also listed by name on the SPLC's webpage, the one that identifies groups and individuals that the SPLC labels as extremists. So they labeled him a racist and a dangerous extremist on their website in order to get donors to fund them, and then they sent the donors' money to the man that even they had outed as being a racist that was perpetrating hate out in the community. That is the kind of despicable corruption that we are talking about here. That same paid informant, the one that was labeled a racist by them, F30, is the same individual who led the National Socialist Party of America, Nazis, and had previously led a faction of the white supremacist group known as Aryan Nation. That informant, the one paid big donor money by the SPLC and a leader of the National Socialist Party, was also a former Klan member. The indictment stated, in addition to directly paying leaders and others associated with the same violent extremist groups that the SPLC sought donations ostensibly to dismantle, the SPLC also used F's, field operatives, to indirectly funnel money to other violent extremist group leaders. And the scam worked as intended. On the left, George Clooney alone made a $1 million donation to the Southern Poverty Law Center right after the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, the one that they funded, in his effort to combat hate by unwittingly funding it. I assume unwittingly, George. Your wife's racial bigotry is clearly deliberate, but I'll still try to give you the benefit of the doubt, even though I cannot say the same for your appalling taste in women. Many people on the right have criticized the SPLC, even before this, for lumping white supremacists and neo-Nazis in together with mainstream conservatives. Now, it turns out that was the point all along. They funded the racism, they funded the extremism, they incited the racism and the extremism so that they would be able to point the fingers to the supposed source of the racism when the source was actually them. It should also be noted that it was the SPLC that falsely accused Border Patrol agents of whipping Haitian migrants. An internal probe at the CBP found those accusations to be entirely groundless and completely false, totally made up. The Southern Poverty Law Center also pressured the Biden administration to release a convicted sex offender that was trans and had been issued a green card here, which led to career officials determining that this transgender identifying woman should be released with a tracking device in 2021. The SPLC's initiation of this was recorded in an email that described the sex offender as not being a, quote, public safety enforcement priority. That email was obtained via a Freedom of Information Act request. The Filipino immigrant in question had previously served more than 8 years behind bars for sexually assaulting a 14-year-old girl. At the time, the trans sex criminal was almost 20 years old and had been pursuing her victim online since that little girl was 12. The victim had lied about her age, but even after the nearly 20-year-old adult learned that the little girl was only 14, the transgender identifying woman proceeded with the meetup and engaged in sexual conduct. The SPLC's email arguing in favor of her release was the one that stated that, even while they admitted that the conviction on its face appears grave and justly concerning. Still, they pushed for the concerning sex criminal's release, presumably because she was trans and therefore part of a special group, because we all know that they would not have done the same for a white redneck man who had done the exact same thing, nor should they. Under Biden, they got their way, and the trans sex predator was released into the public. Speaking of the abusers of children, on Tuesday, the Justice Department announced that the FBI had rescued and returned a 10-year-old Utah boy to his mother after he was kidnapped and taken to Cuba by his father, who identifies as trans. The boy's family had reason to fear that this father intended to subject the child to transgender procedures as well. Now, the authorities have charged 42-year-old Inessa Ethington, who goes by the name Rose, and his 32-year-old partner, Blue Inessa Ethington, with international parental kidnapping after the unsurprisingly gender-confused little boy was taken to Cuba illegally. The boy has now been safely returned to his mother. The little boy, who does identify as a girl at this point, had been splitting his time between his divorced parents who shared custody of him in Utah. The boy was supposed to go on a camping trip to Canada with his trans father and his trans father's lover, Blue. That was the cover story, but instead, the couple kidnapped him and took him out of the country, which is how he ended up in Cuba. Here's what happened. Court documents state that the two men left Utah with the child on March 28, 2026, telling the little boy's mother the cover story that they were heading to Alberta, Canada. The child later called her and said that they had arrived, but the group could not be reached after that. According to investigators, on March 29th, the group crossed into British Columbia at the Douglas port of entry. Then they flew to Mexico that same day before arriving in Havana, Cuba on April 1st, 2026. The unsurprisingly gender-confused little boy's family told authorities that they feared that the 10-year-old child's father, Rose, intended to force his son to undergo transgender surgery abroad. I would point out, he's 10. There's only one transgender surgery for a pre-adolescent male that they could do, and that's bottom surgery. He intended to do this against the little boy's mother's wishes, even though she had been granted joint custody rights by a court of law. No doubt, New York Magazine will want to issue an article about the domineering patriarchy within the trans community. No? Too much consistency for you? Yeah, I thought so. According to the criminal complaint, the family of the barely pre-adolescent child stated that they were afraid that the little boy was transported to Cuba for gender reassignment surgery prior to puberty. According to the FBI, a search of the kidnapping pair's residence turned up a to-do list that included learn Spanish, along with travel plans, an intent to withdraw $10,000 in cash, and indications that they plan to empty a bank account. The criminal complaint stated that recovered notes include instructions from a mental health therapist located in Washington, D.C., including instructions to send the therapist the $10,000 and instructions on gender-affirming medical care for children. Sounds like that therapist needs to be arrested as an accomplice to a kidnapping. On April 13th, a Utah judge granted the boy's mother full custody of the boy and ordered him to be returned to her. According to the Justice Department, his father, Rose, and his father's lover, Blue, were located by Cuban authorities on April 16th. Thank you to the authorities of Cuba. The two kidnappers were deported from Cuba On Monday, there's an interesting reversal, and the child was returned safely home to Utah, thankfully. The director of the FBI, Kash Patel, told the Daily Wire that this rescue was merely the latest example of the Bureau protecting children from law-breaking criminals, saying, each and every day, this FBI is stepping up to protect kids in America at levels never seen before, identifying and rescuing 6,200 child victims just last year alone. This case is no different. We are proud of our agents, intel analysts, and partners who acted quickly and saved a young child from what could have been a horrific kidnapping. Let it be a message to any criminal actor who would try the same thing. This FBI will find you no matter where you try to hide. Both of the criminal defendants appeared in court for an arraignment in Virginia, and they will now be transferred back to Utah for further proceedings. The best solution would be for these two men to spend the next 8 years in prison for kidnapping, by which point the child will no longer be a minor and no longer be vulnerable. The second best option is that you get as close to that as possible. And then, given the fact that you have proven yourself to be a danger to your own child, showing yourself to be someone who is completely willing to break the laws that clearly state that you are not the only one who gets to determine this child's fate. His mother does actually count too, with your track record for being entirely untrustworthy and for shattering the rules instead of playing by them, and considering that the priority is the child, not the grown man, he needs to be allowed only supervised visitation rights at most from now on until the child is 18. What would actually be the most healthy thing for the child would be removing him from his father's dangerous influence. And as I said, I care about the child, not about the grown-ass man with plans to butcher his own son's genitals in order to get his own immature and reality-denying way. Throwing your child against the brick wall of reality and shattering him there has consequences. And we should not allow you to continue to abuse him. And speaking of contagious mind viruses, it's the right's turn. An Indian scammer is openly bragging online about making huge amounts of money by conning super dumb, his words, conservative men with his AI-generated social media accounts. The 22-year-old med student, who was identified in an interview with Wired under the pseudonym Sam, proudly admitted that he created an entirely fictional character named Emily Hart to help pay for his med school. The entirely AI-generated sexy blonde persona that he created was active on Facebook, Instagram, and FanView, which is a competitor of OnlyFans, the infamous porn site, except that FanView allows AI-generated content and OnlyFans does not. That should have been your first clue. The scammer that was hiding behind the name Sam proudly told how he used Google's chatbot, Gemini, to help identify a target audience for his scam, claiming that Google's chatbot was the one who suggested to him that the MAGA conservative niche could be particularly lucrative to him because, quote, the conservative audience, especially older men in the U.S., often has higher disposable incomes and is more loyal. Sam then tailored the content on his accounts accordingly. So photos were published that depicted Emily as a nurse, taking part in activities like ice fishing, drinking Coors Light beer, and shooting off a few rounds at the rifle range. These tipped no one off as being non-reality. one where a blonde, bombshell, sexy nurse enjoys chugging beer and ice fishing? If you actually fall for that, I can't help you. One caption on the account said, "If you want a reason to unfollow, Christ is king, abortion is murder, and all illegals must be deported," end quote. While another said, "POV, you were assigned intelligent at birth, but you identify as liberal," end quote. Sam told Wired at the time, or that at first, he didn't expect much from the account, but a certain brand of terminally online, highly gullible, very unhappy men didn't let him down, and the account kept growing in its enormous popularity. According to Sam, quote, "Every reel I posted was getting 3 million views, 5 million views, 10 million views. The algorithm loved it." Sam also claimed that an AI hot girl Nazi influencer would blow up and break all the records. At that point, Meta commented in the article by saying that Nazi content was flagged and removed from their platforms, if you say so. When it came to Emily's FanView porn account featuring AI-generated nude photos, the proud con artist said, "I was basically doing nothing, and it was just flooded with money." Both the Facebook and the Instagram accounts that were presented as belonging to the AI Emily Hart have been taken down now. Sam told Wired plainly that he has no regrets about what he did, saying, "I don't feel like I was scamming people." He added that the fans that would go for this kind of stuff probably would have still followed all the same, even if they had known that Emily wasn't real, just because they like the sentiment of it. And I can't say that I can honestly disagree with that when it comes to this particularly sad crowd. So everyone involved in that story, on both sides, are wrong and pathetic. Pivoting to a different breed of men, ones that I can generally respect. John James is a West Point graduate, as well as a Ranger-qualified Apache combat pilot, a veteran of the Iraq War, someone who has created jobs for others in the state of Michigan, and a United States congressman who serves Michigan's 10th district. He is currently a candidate running to be the next governor of Michigan. He wrote this article, and I thought that I would pass it along to you to do with whatever you will. America is watching Michigan. Extreme far-left organizations are embracing and influencing Democrat candidates across our ticket. U.S. Senate candidate Abdul Ed Said is attending rallies with Hassan Piker. Current Secretary of State and gubernatorial candidate Jocelyn Benson is the star operative of a group indicted by the Department of Justice for funding extreme neo-Nazi organizations. I'm running for governor of Michigan because the state that has decided the last 4 presidential elections is about to face the most consequential gubernatorial race in the country. Jocelyn Benson has already manipulated Michigan's elections twice. At 19 years old, she interned for the Southern Poverty Law Center's Intelligence Project, supposedly learning how to infiltrate neo-Nazi organizations. Yesterday, that organization was indicted. In 2020, Benson mailed absentee ballot applications to every registered voter in Michigan. Not every active voter, but every registered voter, whether or not they still lived there. She instructed election clerks statewide to presume the validity of every mail-in ballot without verifying signatures. A nonprofit she founded received a $12 million Zuckerbucks grant on the eve of that election and funneled it to Democrat-aligned political operatives whose sole job was turning out Democrat voters. Her order instructing clerks to stop verifying signatures was found illegal in 2021. Rather than face consequences, she was rewarded with a Presidential Citizens Medal from President Joe Biden. She issued the same order in 2024. Federal courts struck it down again. She then deliberately kept Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on the Michigan ballot after he had formally withdrawn and endorsed President Trump, a calculated attempt to split the conservative vote and hand Michigan to Kamala Harris. Judge David McKeague of the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals did not mince words. In defiance of the U.S. Constitution and state election law, Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson manipulated the presidential ballot in Michigan. A second Sixth Circuit judge agreed that her actions had already cast doubt over the integrity of Michigan's electoral process. Millions of patriots in Michigan turned out to vote and made the 2026 election too big to rig. And President Trump went on to carry Michigan. Now Benson wants a promotion, and she is still serving as Secretary of State, overseeing the very election in which she is running. That alone should disqualify her. To understand Jocelyn Benson, you have to understand the organization that built her. The SPLC is not a civil rights organization. It was a machine built to manufacture division, fundraise off fear, and deploy operatives to use racial chaos as a pathway to institutional power. Its co-founder admitted that the organization's overriding purpose was making money. The DOJ just confirmed the method: manufacture the hatred, point at it publicly, collect the donations, and cut checks to the people doing the hating. Benson started with the SPLC at 19 and became a board member in 2014. She did not stumble into this organization. She was built by it, and she carried everything it taught her directly into Michigan's Secretary of State office. Just this week, the DOJ indicted the SPLC on 11 federal counts for secretly paying at least $3 million to members of the Ku Klux Klan, the National Socialist Party of America, the United Klans of America, and the Aryan Nations. Some payments which began the same year Benson joined their board. Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche was direct. The SPLC was not dismantling these groups. It was instead manufacturing the extremism it purports to oppose by paying sources to stoke racial hatred. Not fighting it, manufacturing it. They labeled Moms for Liberty an extremist group. They put the Family Research Council, a mainstream Christian policy organization, on their hate map. They designated Turning Point USA alongside the KKK in their public database before Charlie Kirk was shot and killed. That is the machine that built Jocelyn Benson. The Trump DOJ has sued Benson for refusing to hand over voter registration records required by federal law, including those for over 17,000 registered voters age 100 or older. Michigan has registered 105% of its adult population to vote. She was held in contempt by the Michigan House for refusing to turn over basic election training manuals that would reveal how clerks were instructed to process ballots. The state that decides presidential elections cannot have its ballots managed by someone federal judges have already called a manipulator. We cannot let her Spanberger our Michigan. We have too much at stake from the top to the bottom of the ticket. Jocelyn Benson is not an outlier. She is the next generation of Democrat operatives, trained to divide, manufacture threats, suppress opposition, and acquire power. Michigan gave my family a shot at the American dream. By the grace of God, I am running for governor to make sure that promise is real again for every family in this state, not just the ones with the right political connections. My purpose has always been to use my blessings to be a blessing to others. That is what took me to Baghdad. That is what brought me home to build. That is what sent me to Congress, and that is what is calling me to Lansing. Jocelyn Benson was built by a machine that profits from division. I was built by Michigan and called by God to serve it. My loyalty is to my Creator, my country, and the families of this great state, not to a machine, not to a party, to the people. Michigan, America is watching. Scott Walter, the president of the Capital Research Center, wrote this midweek. For decades, the Southern Poverty Law Center has had an outsized influence on American government and society, much of it malignant. But that may be coming to an end. Federal prosecutors have announced that a grand jury has indicted the SPLC for financial offenses related to its alleged funding of supposed infiltrators in various white supremacist groups and events, most notably the infamous 2017 Unite the Right riotous demonstration in Charlottesville, Virginia. The government claims the SPLC took money from donors who wanted to counter organized extremism and then funneled it into support for the leaders of extremist groups. Legally, it's a bold claim, and courts will have to decide whether the allegations constitute federal crimes. But politically, the government has a powerful claim. As Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche put it, the SPLC is manufacturing racism to justify its existence. This charitable group was founded in 1971. By the end of its second decade, its lawsuits assaulting Ku Klux Klan groups had successfully bankrupted that ugly movement. Its original mission accomplished, the SPLC didn't declare victory and shut down. Instead, it became a fundraising factory that enriched its coffers by tarring mainstream conservatives and religious groups by unfair association with extremists, lumping together neo-Nazi cadres with respectable conservative groups like the Family Research Council. Compared to other nonprofits, SPLC is lavishly funded. In 2023, the group reported almost $170 million in total revenue, more than the revenues of the Special Olympics, the United Service Organizations, that would be the USO, and the National Park Foundation. SPLC's vast wealth totals roughly $750 million in assets, tens of millions of which are held in offshore accounts, leading to jokes that its Alabama headquarters building is the Poverty Palace, and that the group's motto should be the SPLC making hate pay. Other than swelling the SPLC's domestic and Caribbean bank balances, what did donors get for all this cash? The group's institutional donor list, which contains such left-wing luminaries of big philanthropy as the W.K. Kellogg Foundation and the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, a conduit for big tech billionaire giving, suggests the SPLC had strong ideological motives. Before allegations that the SPLC was funding people at the top of radical white supremacist groups, its most notorious product was its list of hate groups. In addition to counting what seemed like every racist knucklehead who could afford to register a URL, as a hate group, it also tarred as hate groups such mainstream conservative organizations as the legal advocacy group Alliance Defending Freedom, the education advocacy groups Moms for Liberty and Defending Education, and immigration restriction groups like the Center for Immigration Studies. It also branded the conservative political group Turning Point USA an anti-government extremist group, just months before its founder, Charlie Kirk, was assassinated, apparently by a young man who told his roommate in a text, quote, "I had enough of his hatred." Ominously, Kirk had warned that SPLC's listing of his group could lead to violence, recalling that a shooter had attacked the Family Research Council after SPLC hate-listed it. That would-be mass-murdering extremist was stopped after shooting a security guard. He later said he chose his target based on the SPLC's hate map and planned to also kill persons at 3 more conservative groups. Thanks to ideologically sympathetic tech and major media companies, as well as law enforcement authorities like the FBI, the SPLC had its designations treated as if they were somehow official and neutral, rather than ideological weapons that often succeeded in harming targeted mainstream groups' ability to raise money. In 2017, GuideStar, a widely used watchdog of charities, was persuaded not to apply SPLC hate labels to groups. By 2019, SPLC was partnering with the Amalgamated Charitable Foundation, a donor-advised fund provider closely tied to the bank that services the Democratic National Committee and is nearly majority-owned by affiliates of the Service Employee International Union, partnering with them on a pressure campaign to ban contributions from donor-advised funds to so-called hate groups. Still, more scandals plagued SPLC, even as its wealth ballooned. Morris Dees, its founder and longtime litigation director, was canned in 2019 amid widespread allegations of misconduct, including sexist and racist discrimination and sexual harassment. A former employee wrote a long, devastating tell-all in the New Yorker confessing that folks on the left had known for decades that Dees was a super salesman and master fundraiser who viewed civil rights work mainly as a marketing tool for bilking gullible northern liberals, end quote. It remains to be seen if the Justice Department indictment of the SPLC will prevail. But should the shameless operation finally meet its downfall, that downfall would be well deserved. At a minimum, the latest revelations should knock down any last support for the group's claim to moral authority. Speaking of claims that are falling apart, this week, ICE swept up a woman who looks like a soccer mom, but who is believed to be an MS-13 killer. She was hiding out, camouflaging herself in a Washington, D.C. suburb. Adalia Isabel Morales Mejia is an illegal foreigner. who is a national of El Salvador, not us, them. And according to ICE, she is wanted in her own home country for charges of aggravated homicide and illicit associations. Here's what happened. According to ICE, this Salvadorian woman was charged with her alleged crimes in 2013. Authorities in El Salvador notified ICE back in February that they believed Morales Nieja was in Northern Virginia. Once ICE officers learned about her possible presence in the area, they began looking for her. They eventually caught her in Woodbridge. ICE arrested her there on March 12th. On Thursday, the field office director for ICE in Washington, D.C., Robert Guardian, you have to love the irony, stated, Adalia Isabella Morales Nieja is not only a known associate of the notorious MS-13 transnational criminal organization, but she apparently attempted to flee justice in her native country by illegally residing in Virginia. At that point, Director Guardian took aim at some of the members of the media who have criticized ICE for arresting illegal foreign nationals who do not have any rap sheets here, pointing out how misleading their narrative is by saying the media would consider her to be a non-criminal because she has no known criminal history in the United States, despite the fact that she is facing charges for aggravated homicide in El Salvador. ICE Washington, D.C. will continue to prioritize public safety by arresting and removing criminal alien offenders from our Washington, D.C. and Virginia communities. Virginia has become a hub for illegal foreign national crime due to its zealous defense of all of them, no matter what they do there, from the illegal who sexually groped a dozen different high school girls to the illegal that stabbed a young mother to death at a bus stop, to an illegal Guatemalan who chased a woman down again and again trying to rape her, a woman who was just waiting for her rideshare. According to 7 News, the illegal foreigner, also from El Salvador, who was convicted of groping multiple female students at a Virginia high school, was sentenced on Tuesday to less than 1 year, just 360 days behind bars and 2 years of probation for violating a dozen girls by coming up behind them and shoving his hands between their legs to grope their genitals against their will. Fairfax County, which notoriously operates as a sanctuary jurisdiction, has been at the center of most of these and many more national stories, including having been the site of 3 murders tied to illegal suspects just in their one county, just during the few months that we have been in 2026. In a recent interview with 7 News, the new Homeland Security Secretary Mark Wayne Mullen called out the responsible party, that would be the Democrat governor of Virginia, Abigail Spanberger, for clinging to her harmful and bloody policies, saying, if we want to combat crime, which every law enforcement agency and every judge and every elected official should honestly all be on the side of fighting crime and making our streets safe, and we're not seeing that under the current leadership. Yeah, we noticed. And speaking of leadership woes, according to the New York Times, and they were citing senior Iranian officials, Iran's newly installed supreme leader, Khamenei Part 2, Return of the Dictator, is apparently recovering from injuries that are so severe that they may require plastic surgery. He apparently sustained severe burns in the airstrike that killed his father and predecessor, Ali Khamenei. That attack also killed his wife and son, while leaving the 56-year-old leader alive, but physically debilitated, largely isolated and increasingly reliant on military commanders to do the actual governing. Khamenei Part 2 has been completely cut off from most of his officials as he attempts to recover from his injuries that they claim he survived amid concerns that revealing his location could make him a target, according to the New York Times. Despite his supposed condition, officials claim that he remains mentally alert and that he continues to weigh in on major decisions, but they admit that the day-to-day authority has increasingly shifted to Iran's hardline military commanders. Since being selected by Iran's Assembly of Experts following his father's targeted death in March, Khamenei Part 2 has not made a single public appearance or even offered a photo as proof of life, releasing only written statements that were issued in his name, leading to increasing questions about whether or not he is even actually alive. And now, Iran is prepping the world for extensive plastic surgery, as the cover story for why, whoever they eventually produce, is now unrecognizable. The Times reported that supposed Khamenei, the sequel, has injuries that include significant damage to one leg and one hand that will require multiple surgeries to repair, as well as severe facial burns that have limited his ability to speak and could likely necessitate reconstructive surgery to his face. While he's locked in a room with Yul Brynner being schooled on his new identity. It's a movie reference, look it up. Hint, Ingrid Bergman. The supposed leader communicates with the outside world only by written messages, never video, and his regime is relying on an entire network of trusted couriers that relay the handwritten messages, delivering them down the chain without ever seeing anyone themselves, traveling by car and motorcade to avoid detection, supposedly for the new supreme leader's protection. If he is still alive, and that's a huge if, here's the leader's backstory. A Nepo baby, born into Iran's ruling elite, Khamenei Part 2 blended religious studies with military involvement, two pursuits that seem to be inseparable in that region of the terrorist-producing world. As a teenager, little Khamenei joined an Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps brigade that is known as the Habib Battalion. That was during the Iran-Iraq War. He later completed his education at a theological seminary, was given the rank of Ayatollah, and worked closely with his father as a part of the dictator's inner circle, where he helped coordinate military and intelligence operations. Despite his influence over power, he has never been elected by anyone to hold any office at all. He has never even served in a formal senior government role. But that doesn't mean that he hasn't been wielding power. It just was not power that was wielded with the consent of the people under him. For his role in power, he has faced sanctions from the U.S. Treasury Department in 2019, and he has also been accused of being involved in the regime's crackdown on the 2009 Green Movement protests. So here's the progression. The Islamic Republic's founder, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khamenei, no relation, overthrew Iran's Shah during the 1979 revolution. The elder Khamenei was selected as supreme leader following his death, the founder's death. His son, or whoever they are prepping for extensive facial plastic surgery, has now assumed the top position, which has only raised questions about if nepotism is now the way of the Islamic Republic too, then how is it any different from the dynastic rulers that it overthrew? with supposed Khamenei the sequel sidelined by his injuries. Hardline generals have taken on the dominant role in the decision-making. These generals are the ones shaping Iran's decisions at a critical moment in history. They are believed to be behind Tehran's refusal to participate in a second round of talks with American officials in Pakistan this week. After the Times reported about the power shifts and the reasons for them, senior Iranian officials desperately tried to project unity, issuing suspiciously aligned statements, all reaffirming their loyalty to the Khamenei regime, even as military leaders are taking over the real decision-making. President Mossad Pezeshkian insisted that there are no internal divisions, writing, "In Iran, there are no hardliners or moderates, only unity and obedience to the supreme leader." Okay. The Parliament Speaker, Mohammed Bagher Ghalabat, and the so-called Judiciary Chief, Ghulam Hussein Mohseni Jai, echoed the exact same message, surprisingly enough. It is so funny watching different cultures try to sell what works in their culture to a culture that they don't understand is totally different and does not buy it. And speaking of those that are very well acquainted with the bloody realities of terrorists, the very gifted writer and famous speaker, a woman for whom I have enormous respect, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, a highly intelligent voice who has been infamously targeted by murderous threats from Islamic terrorists, but has yet to be silenced by them, bravely continuing, lauded the federal indictment against the Southern Poverty Law Center, asserting that it validates the very criticisms that have been made against that organization for years, and she would know. In an opinion piece titled, "The SPLC Targeted Me. Now its reckoning has come," Ms. Hirsi Ali wrote that the indictment was not a surprise. The only surprise was why it took so long and why this group was allowed to randomly terrorize those who had differing opinions for so many years. She pointed to her own experience with the SPLC as just one example. In 2016, the Southern Poverty Law Center included Ms. Hirsi Ali in a publication of theirs that was issued to smear people that they decided to label as anti-Muslim extremists. Ms. Hirsi Ali was born Muslim, and she suffered forced female circumcision at their hands. So, she speaks about what happened to her, and also about the dangers of unchecked, violence-seeking terrorist ideologies, with which she is also intimately familiar through her own extensive experience. You bigots. Yes, bigot. A bigot would be someone who judges someone else without knowing anything about them or their people, having only their preconceived prejudices to guide the very inaccurate beliefs that they hold. Ms. Hirsi Ali pointed out that the SPLC's reckless 2016 blacklisting of her in this way was especially dangerous because it came at a time when Islamist violence was actively killing writers like her, as well as cartoonists and dissidents all across Europe. She reminded the world that she has had to spend more than 2 decades under armed protection after extremist threats against her intensified right after the 2004 murder of the filmmaker Theo Van Gogh took place. His killer left a note naming her as his next target. The SPLC didn't seem to think he needed to be labeled as an extremist, but his victim sure did. That history, which happened well before the SPLC recklessly labeled her as an extremist enemy who was anti-Muslim, not anti-terrorist, anti-Muslim, doing so purely for their own political benefit. All of that made the SPLC's decision to publicly classify Miss Hirsi Ali as an anti-Muslim extremist not just defamatory, but dangerous, and they knew it. They don't just try to silence people who object to terrorists. They are terrorists, putting out hit lists. Miss Hirsi Ali argued that the list that targeted her unfairly grouped critics of Islamist ideology together and exposed all of them to potential danger at a time of heightened terrorist threats in Europe and elsewhere. She also referenced a 2018 lawsuit by Majid Naaz, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing her name, another figure that was named on the list in their so-called report. That lawsuit resulted in a multi-million-dollar settlement and a public apology from the SPLC. Ms. Hirsi Ali did not receive a similar apology, although it was very much due to her. After this week's news, she wrote this: "The list handed journalists a ready-made roster of 15 people whose views were to be seen as toxic. But to call it a mere reference guide is to understate what it was. It was published at the peak of a jihadist campaign of terror against the West. The ISIS caliphate still held territory across Syria and Iraq. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Al-Qaeda, was issuing hit lists of writers and cartoonists in its English language magazine. In January 2015, 2 of ACAP's followers walked into the offices of the magazine Charlie Hebdo in Paris and murdered 12 people, some of them cartoonists, whose offense was drawing. 10 months later, a coordinated ISIS cell killed 130 at Paris's Bataclan Theater and the cafes around it. Terrorist attacks in Brussels, Nice, Berlin, and Manchester soon followed. This was the climate in which the SPLC chose to publish the names, faces, and affiliations of 15 people it accused of anti-Muslim extremism. The list endangered everyone it named. I have lived under armed protection for more than 2 decades because men with weapons and conviction want me dead for apostasy, for writing about Islamist-driven anti-Semitism and the subversive actions of the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist groups in the West, for drawing attention to practices such as honor killings and female genital mutilation, for arguing that Muslim women deserve the same protections under the law as other women. An organization founded to combat bigotry chose to place me on a list together with others whose lives were already under threat from the same movements, just for having the audacity to combat Islamist bigotry." Ms. Hirsi Ali then pointed to the non-existent integrity of the SPLC's widely cited hate map, arguing that it had expanded over time to include mainstream conservative and religious groups. She referenced a 2012 shooting at the Family Research Council, a group that they had maliciously put on their hate map, pointing out that the shooter reportedly admitted that he had used the SPLC's map to identify his targets, and citing this as an example of the real-world consequences of this kind of stuff. She framed the SPLC's trajectory as part of a much broader pattern, in which institutions drift well away from their original missions. She argued that this group had evolved from being a civil rights organization that was originally focused on combating violent white supremacist groups into being a group that targets its own ideological opponents with its public authority, all to gain money and power, which they abuse. Ms. Hirsi Ali highlighted major spikes in donations to the SPLC following high-profile events such as the 2017 Charlottesville rally and the 2020 protests after George Floyd's death. Ms. Hirsi Ali acknowledged that an indictment is not the same thing as a conviction, but she sees this as a significant moment of accountability nonetheless. She concluded that donors, journalists, and the public should apply greater scrutiny to influential advocacy organizations, especially those that position themselves as the arbiters of extremism and hate, rather than putting them into positions where their word is accepted as gospel, because that's how this happens. And then lots of innocent people get hurt as others get drunk on power. And speaking of actual extremist haters who somehow don't wind up on the hate lists, 2 teenagers were arrested earlier this week and charged with plotting a major attack on one of the largest Jewish synagogues in Houston. One of the young bigots that were arrested on Wednesday was 18-year-old Angelina Han Hicks of Lexington, North Carolina. The Associated Press reported that she was apparently planning to, quote, kill as many Jews as possible in an attack on the congregation of Beth Israel in Houston, Texas. Angelina Hicks now stands accused of plotting this attack alongside 2 male subjects. Together, they plan to murder Jewish worshipers by driving a vehicle through the synagogue on a date that they had already chosen, according to the court documents. The Houston Police Department announced on Thursday that a 16-year-old co-conspirator was arrested there as well and charged with conspiracy to commit capital murder. They said that this arrest was in relation to a threat directed towards certain Jewish institutions in our area. The Houston police did not specifically say that this 16-year-old was arrested for the planned attack on Congregation Beth Israel, but authorities in the largest city in Texas did say that they learned about the threat on the same day that Angelina Hicks was taken into custody in North Carolina. The Houston Chronicle reported that court documents had identified Angelina's alleged co-conspirators as Tegan and Angel. Their target, Congregation Beth Israel, a synagogue which also runs a school for pre-K through 5th graders, closed on Wednesday out of an abundance of caution after Houston police informed them of the threat. The synagogue reopened the next day. On the law enforcement side, the FBI stated that its Charlotte Joint Terrorism Task Force began investigating this alleged plot on Tuesday evening after a tip to a North Carolina law enforcement agency came in. The FBI added that this is an exceptional example of when you see something concerning, you say something to law enforcement. Angelina Hicks now faces 2 felony charges of conspiracy to commit murder and felony conspiracy to commit assault with a deadly weapon. Her bond was set at $10 million, with District Court Judge Carlton Terry correctly saying on Wednesday that her detention is designed to prevent her from getting a chance to communicate with either of those co-conspirators or those who could relay a message and put lives at risk. The lawyer for Angelina Hicks has already said that his client's young age could be a major factor in her legal defense. Wrong. She is 18 years old, and even if she wasn't, if you are old enough to kill, to take life, and to spill blood, then you are old enough to face the consequences, 18 or not. A life for a life, baby. I am not playing with you little baby thug terrorist wannabes. F-A-F-O. We are all getting sick of this and of you. I understand that you're young and stupid, and that makes you susceptible to the stupidest mind virus that has ever been invented by humanity. simply because you live online like losers. But understanding it and excusing it are not the same thing. So hear me now, baby badasses. You are either going to have to evolve and develop an immunity against this mind-numbingly stupid shit, or the opportunity to do so is going to be taken away from you permanently. We will throw your asses in jail and leave you there until your dying day if that's what it takes. I wish you could look into my eyes right now, because you would have no doubt that I mean it. In the meantime, North Carolina prosecutors warned that there could still be an imminent event targeting Congregation Beth Israel. And, of course, it goes without saying that it has been less than 1 month since a Muslim man rammed his vehicle into the largest Jewish Reform synagogue in the entire United States in a Michigan attack that the Justice Department said was directed by Hezbollah. That synagogue also contained a daycare with dozens of children inside at the time. That rampaging terrorist was shot dead in self-defense. And that is going to become the best case scenario for any of you little jihadi morons who keep trying this. But jihadis aren't the only source of problems. There's also commies and insanely deranged liberals too. It's just ironic how frequently those three groups overlap. According to the Daily Wire, records prove that New York City's most elite hospital gave more than $1 million to an anti-racist, pro-LGBTQ+ theater company, even as it laid off 1,000 workers due to financial restraints. Yet New York Presbyterian donated at least $1.3 million to the People's Theater Project just since 2021. That is all shown in the financial records. In October of 2023, Dr. Stephen J. Corwin, who was the president and CEO of that hospital system at the time, pledged to give another $1 million to the theater to build a state-of-the-art performance center for an arts program that, quote, centers immigrants and members of the Latino, Black, and queer communities. At the exact time that this hospital, a place that has its own purpose for existing, which would be to provide medical care to the sick and injured. If you don't want to do that and you want to promote a theater, go work for the theater. While they were busy as a hospital bankrolling the anti-racist theater organization's quest to build a world where the oppressed can find liberation through playing dress-up, the hospital was struggling to meet its own financial responsibilities. So in May 2025, it announced that it was slashing 2% of its workforce by firing 1,000 people from the jobs that they used to support themselves. In 2026, the hospital offered their remaining nurses a lower than requested annual raise, which they blamed on Trump's economic policies without bothering to mention that they were unnecessarily shoveling millions into an LGBT theater instead of paying their employees a fair wage. Corwin announced that he would step down in early 2026. He had been in charge for 14 years, and the reputation of New York Presbyterian took a serious hit as the final years of his reign unfolded. The hospital's financial troubles just so happened to coincide with it becoming one of the most expensive hospitals in the entire country. In March of 2026, the Justice Department sued the hospital for anti-competitive contract restrictions that deny New Yorkers the choice of lower-cost healthcare options. But all the while, as it ripped off its vulnerable patients with excessively high bills, underpaid its now overburdened staff, and fired 1,000 people from the jobs that they relied on, this hospital a hospital, made sure that its top priority was still funded, and its top priority was not health care. It was supporting the People's Theater Project. In October of 2023, Corwin appeared with New York's Governor Kathy Hochul and the composer of Hamilton, Lin-Manuel Miranda, to pledge another $1 million to the construction of the Centro Cultural Immigrante, which is a 19,000 square foot compound featuring multiple theaters and a gallery, all meant to amplify the voices of New York City's diverse immigrant communities, a huge portion of which are illegal due to sanctuary policies there. The state of New York itself contributed $4 million of the taxpayers' money, because they have no money of their own. All of their money is your money, to that project. It was founded by Mino Lora, a leftist extremist who has publicly called for defunding the police and who served on Zoran Mandami's transition team that year, the year that this group was founded. New York Presbyterian first partnered with them on a, quote, health-focused theater-making program for children ages 5 through 12. All told, New York Presbyterian has given the People's Theater Project $1,312,500 since 2021. Maybe more if they made good on their pledge of another $1 million. During that time, the theater that they're funding has produced plays like The Diamond, which, quote, follows a group of detained immigrants, they would only be detained if they were illegal, who conspire against a dystopian government. So they're encouraging foreigners to rise up and overthrow our government. The People's Theater Project also hosts outright political events, including a rapid response and safe space to share feelings, build resilience, and transform emotions into art in the wake of President Trump's 2024 election. This January, the theater also hosted an Undoing Racism workshop. The People's Theater Project works with K through 5 young artists to celebrate their identities and communities. I got news for you people. Kindergartners don't have identities, but they're celebrating them through theater pieces. And it has a social justice leadership program for adolescents in grades 6 through 12. That sounds like it'll produce wonderful people. The organization also partners with elementary, middle, and high schools across New York City. The organization views its mission as dismantling systemic racism, promoting immigrant rights, and LGBTQIA+ rights. This really couldn't get any sadder. Their website declares, racial justice is an urgent priority because systemic racism persists in our society, perpetrating inequality at every turn. Theater serves as a powerful platform to confront and dismantle these injustices. The ones that don't exist, yes. Fairy tale make-believe will no doubt slay the dragon that isn't there, Don Quixote. So, when you get shot in Mandami's crime-ridden city and there are no doctors to treat you in the hospital, and they still charge you $100,000 for the Band-Aid that they slap on your gunshot wound, you'll know which priorities the money all went to. That would be the make-believe ones that real people cannot even dream of being in a life with so much luxury in it that you actually view the world this way. It's amazing what having to work a real job for a living does for your perspective. Perhaps we should make that a mandatory thing. What do you think? Now, transitioning from gay immigrant theater to the immigration debate itself. On Friday, the Washington Post reported that a federal appeals court has ruled that President Trump's order declaring an invasion at the U.S.-Mexico border was illegal, meaning that the southern border could soon reopen to massive waves of illegals, in that this ruling does pave the way for resuming mass asylum proceedings. However, the Trump administration is expected to obviously appeal this decision, which would at the very least delay any reopening of the floodgates. To recap the situation here, on his first day back in office, Trump issued a proclamation that effectively shut down asylum at the southern border, stating that this order would remain in place, quote, until I issue a finding that the invasion at the southern border has ceased. That order did lead to months of historically low levels of illegal border crossings. According to CBP data, Border Patrol has apprehended fewer than 9,000 illegal foreigners at the southern border each month since Trump took office. Monthly encounters with illegal crossers have fallen below the daily levels that were seen on some days during the Biden administration, when literally millions of foreigners crossed the border illegally and were allowed to remain inside the country for years, due to the massive court backlog that these policies and the resulting border crisis created. The Trump administration sought to end the incentives to enter illegally by turning off the asylum fire hose, which was being grossly abused, given that most of the illegals who invaded our country did not qualify for asylum grounds in any way. But with the courts backlogged so severely, that didn't matter. If they made the claim, they got in. According to the Washington Post, so-called immigrant rights organizations, the ACLU, sued over Trump's policy, arguing that this violated the Immigration and Nationality Act, the INA, by denying foreigners that were fleeing persecution the ability to claim asylum at the border, as though we are the only country on earth that is an option besides their own. I could have swear that there's more than 2 countries on this planet. Even if they were truly being persecuted in their own homeland, they usually have to cross through several safe countries in order to get here, which alone invalidates, legally speaking, their asylum claim, because they are safe in any one of those safe countries. Asylum does not mean that you get access to your first choice and alternatives. As soon as you are out of the country that is endangering you, and in a safe one, your asylum claim is over. That is how asylum works, just in case no one has told you the facts. You have a right to safety and to not be persecuted. You do not have a right to demand access to whichever country in the world tickles your fancy. The first safe country that you cross through is the one that owes you asylum, legally speaking. If you reject that safety, that's on you. You are not owed asylum in any other country. That is the way that asylum works. Lee Gillert, an attorney with the ACLU, the group who sued to make this happen, claimed that the court's opinion does not mean that there are now open borders, but only that the United States will no longer be one of the few countries in the world who, after World War II, does not provide a hearing for those fleeing persecution. To quote How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days, bullshit. It means open borders. Because you have to let them in until they get their hearing, and the courts cannot hear that many cases, as has already been demonstrated, so they will come in and they will disappear like they did last time. It means open borders. We're not stupid, dumbass. In its opinion, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit asserted that the law does not grant Trump the broad authority that he asserted in his proclamation. I don't know if that's true or not. I stick to what I know. The court wrote, "We conclude that the INA's text, structure, and history make clear that in supplying power to suspend entry by presidential proclamation, so they do admit that that power is legally granted to the executive branch, Congress did not intend to grant the executive the expansive removal authority it asserts. I'm requesting proof of your ability to read the minds of Congress, please. We'll see how that holds up. They granted it, true, but we don't personally think that they intended to. That's how I read that ruling. That decision was issued by a 3-judge panel, with one judge partially concurring and partially dissenting from the ruling. As stated, the Trump administration is expected to appeal the decision to a higher court, and that will at the very least delay any reopening of the floodgates. But in the meantime, this right here is a glimpse of what is going to happen if you don't shut the left out of power hard in 2026 and 28, hard enough to make them pivot. Because this is their plan. Another 15 to 20 million. And speaking of very shady abuses of power and big money scams, a California winery that is co-owned by the husband of Ilhan Omar quickly shut down after inquiries into Omar's finances began. Santa Rosa Winery closed down on April 4th, hot on the heels of intense scrutiny by the House on Omar's financial reporting. Congressman James Comer of Kentucky, the chair of the House Oversight Committee, sent a letter to Omar's husband, Tim Minette, at the beginning of February, after a review of Omar's financial disclosure paperwork revealed a massive red flag. Here's what happened. Omar's 2024 financial disclosure placed the value of her joint assets at somewhere between $6 million and $30 million. A huge gap, and also a very significant leap from the numbers that were reported in her 2023 form just 1 year before that. The congressional letter to her husband stated, "Financial disclosure forms filed by your wife, Representative Ilhan Omar of Minnesota, show E Street Crew, LLC, and Rose Lake Capital, LLC, which you hold ownership stakes in, went from being worth as much as, meaning at the most, $51,000 in 2023 to as much as $30 million in 2024. Representative Comer also noted concerns over the fact that the companies that are associated with the winery do not disclose who their investors are. So the sudden and drastic increase in the value of the winery could very well be linked to individuals that are buying the influence of Omar in our Congress. Representative Comer added in the letter, "Media reports further suggest that you may have raised money from investors using misleading information, meaning some of those funds may have been obtained improperly." After the scrutiny began, Omar grossly revised her disclosure forms in March, suddenly claiming that her joint assets with her husband were worth less than $100,000 instead of being worth the between $6 and $30 million that she had originally claimed. And she pointed out that she still holds at least $15,000 in student loan debt. Well, a spokesperson for Omar blamed accounting errors for the massive discrepancy here, for whatever that's worth to you. Those are pretty humongous discrepancies, hun. And it's not even like you can claim that extra zeros were accidentally added, because even if you add extra zeros onto $100,000 through a clerical error, you still do not come up with $6 million or with $30 million. And if nothing fishy is going on, then why did you just suddenly close down the very shady winery that you own? The continuing financial scrutiny of Omar also coincides with her being faced with very legitimate questions about her relationship with the individuals that were behind the Feeding Our Future scam, a $250 million fraud scheme that exploited a federally funded child nutrition program during COVID. Minnesota lawmakers have demanded that Omar turn over any documents and communications between herself and the owners of the restaurant that is at the heart of the scandal. That would be the same restaurant owner that she was reportedly photographed with at the restaurant where she reportedly held her political victory party. Lawmakers have given her a deadline of May 5th to turn over those records. According to the committee chair and state representative, Kristen Robbins, Omar also recently no-showed her summons to appear before the State Oversight Committee for questions from the elected representatives of the people, saying the fact that she ghosted us, she would not even respond to multiple inquiries from a state legislator where she used to serve. I think it shows disdain for Minnesota's taxpayers that she's unwilling to even answer these questions. I totally agree with that, but it is not surprising, given that utter disdain for Americans and contemptuous revulsion for the country that they built and let her into are the only emotions that this woman has ever displayed throughout her entire life. Speaking of people who are way overdue for a lesson, one that in this case introduces them to the reality that they are not actually the supreme dictator of the world and of all of their fellow human beings. A North Carolina school board is consistently refusing to protect their female students in bathrooms and locker rooms, despite months of legitimate concerns being respectfully raised by both students and parents. But none of them count. Only the board members do. They're special, you see. Trista Ruck, a junior at Cox Mills High School in Cabarrus County, addressed the county school board last December and respectfully asked them to create an official policy defending female-only spaces at the school by enforcing the female-only part. At Miss Ruck's school, a male student who decides to identify as a woman in order to gain access to the spaces where he can watch girls get naked is allowed to. Right now, there is currently a boy that is a cheerleader for the football and basketball teams who is eagerly using the women's locker rooms and restrooms against the wishes of the females that he is forcing himself on. There is a word for that. Ms. Ruck stated, "Many of my peers and I feel uncomfortable using facilities designed for women and women alone, as he has different reproductive parts than we do." She pointed out that both parents and students had discussed these problems with the administration of Cox Mills High School, as well as with the athletic director there, only to be blatantly ignored. Ms. Ruck said that the school made special accommodations for the many female students instead of doing so for the single trans student. So they were kicked out of their spaces and treated collectively as still being worth less when added all together as women than a single male was worth. Nice message. Ms. Ruck said that one of her friends, who is on the school's sports team, openly said that she had caught this male student watching her and other female students changing while he is in the locker room with them. Telling the board, she stated that this made her feel extremely uncomfortable and that she did not feel safe or respected in that environment. That student was told to take her problems to the principal. And when she did, the principal told her that her rights were, quote, too political to address, and that any action might be interpreted the wrong way, so nothing was done. Ms. Ruck pointed out to the so-called adults in power, our school is supposed to make every student safe, but we get ostracized when we discuss this with adults who are supposed to ensure the safety and comfortability at school. Personally, I try to avoid the restrooms at all costs, but I do use these facilities at times when I really have to. I, as well as others, do not feel comfortable when an individual of the opposite gender is allowed and authorized to use our facilities. In addition to the obvious safety concerns here over having males in female spaces, especially ones where they're naked and often in isolated space, vulnerable. In addition to that, according to Columbia University's Irving Medical Center, having to avoid using the restrooms that were created for females can lead to real health problems, including chronic pain and urinary tract infections. Habitually holding in urine for long periods of time can also make it difficult to fully empty one's bladder, and it can also cause pelvic floor dysfunction. According to election data, Cabarrus County voted for President Trump in 2024, so this radical school board is not reflecting the desires of its own community, the one that elected them. But despite repeatedly raising concerns in the right way, the board has refused to institute any county-wide policies that protect women's bathrooms and locker rooms, which means that it is time to show them who's boss. Take over that board by voting them all out of power and never relent on that. Blacklist them for life. Make a statement. End of problem. Alexis Hughes, the founder of You Heard Her, an advocacy group for female students in Cabarrus County, slammed that board for ignoring young Miss Rook and other students at its most recent meeting, which was held on April 13th, saying, "This is not about hate or judging any child, and this is not about asking the board to take a position on personal beliefs or ideology. What you are responsible for is ensuring students are safe, that their privacy is protected, and that policies are clear and consistently applied. She came to you all for help. You heard her. You did nothing. Shame. There is nothing political about a child that feels unsafe when they are changing clothes. That is a basic expectation of privacy, and it is all of your responsibility." Multiple other speakers at that April meeting slammed the board for not taking any action to protect their female students. At the end of the public comment section, the board carried on with its usual business without offering a single word to even address any of the speakers' concerns. Just utter dismissal and a clear challenge to make them care and count you. Challenge accepted. Ms. Hughes told the board, "This comes down to three things: safety, privacy, and respect for every student. Transgender students deserve protection, but policy has to protect all students. And right now, the absence of policy is failing every single student in our district. So do something. Drag them from their seats of power and vote them all out in an extreme show of force. You do not actually have to take this. And it is time that you realize that. And you know what? It is time for them to realize that too. And speaking of realizing that you do not have to take bad governance being inflicted on you from the top down, that you do have agency in this world, the former reality star, with whom I am not familiar, a man named Spencer Pratt, is currently running for mayor of Los Angeles, running against the incumbent disaster, Karen Bass. He is taking a stand right now for the animals in LA that are allegedly being tortured by disturbed homeless people in the community. Pratt has been posting about local animals being abused on Skid Row and beyond for weeks now, sharing evidence in the form of graphic videos of poor little dogs overdosing on fentanyl, and one dog who had even had his eyes sewn shut by some sicko. On April 20th, Pratt posted, "As mayor, I will stand up a dedicated LAPD task force, tactical pause, policing animal welfare and safety. We will end the horrific atrocities that Karen Basura, which is his nickname for Bass, and Nithya Raman, an LA councilwoman, have allowed in our streets. Zero tolerance for animal abusers." In response to a video of a dog that was receiving emergency medical care for the drugs that had been put into its system, he said, "This is uncaring Karen's legacy. Unbelievable levels of evil from the druggies that are left to massacre these poor animals. This ends when I'm mayor." In another video published on Instagram on Friday, he accused Bass and Rahman of facilitating the torture, mutilation, abuse, and murder of thousands of dogs by crazy drug addicts who breed them for money, set them on fire, and conduct Nazi-like experiments on them. Pratt says that the abused dogs become drug testers for the addicts and are frequently overdosed that way. He also said that Rahman allegedly walked out of a recent city council meeting after an animal rescue worker begged her for help with this very problem. He was not alone in caring about the poor animals that are being abused in this way due to willful blindness. We don't want to see it. We will not address it, so we're just going to let it keep happening. Not everyone feels that way. There was a rally for this issue at the Barkery in Encino on Saturday to raise awareness about the horrible abuse that is being allowed en masse and to, quote, "save our pets from the zombies." This issue has not been the only one where the mayor of LA has been completely MIA, abdicating her responsibilities, the ones that she said she wanted, the ones that she took on of her own free will, and therefore she is the one to blame for the horrifying outcomes. Pratt announced that he was running for mayor on the 1-year anniversary of the Palisades fire, the event that he says radicalized him to do whatever it took to make a positive change in his community. Pratt and his wife, Heidi Montag, and his parents all lost their homes in those fires. He, like many others, have been duly critical of the local Democrats in power at the time for their actions both before and after the fires, from refusing to clear the brush that became the fuel for the fire, to not having water in the fire hydrants during fire season, to cutting the fire department for a bunch of nonsensical ideological priorities, to taking unnecessary international trips showboating around the world while the fire was taking place, to not doing near enough to help the victims get the permits that they need to rebuild even a year later. When he announced his candidacy, Pratt stated the system in Los Angeles isn't struggling, it's fundamentally broken. It is a machine designed to protect the people at the top and the friends they exchange favors with, while the rest of us drowned in the toxic smoke and ash. Pratt is a first-time candidate facing more than a dozen other contenders in the nonpartisan mayoral primary that will be held in June. The current disaster of a mayor, Karen Bass, has the gall to actually be seeking re-election. Hopefully, the people of LA are fed up enough to give her the answer that she has actually merited. We've started on a positive story, and that's how we're going to end. According to a statement from China that was made on Friday, a pair of giant pandas will be making their way to America as part of a 10-year agreement with the China Wildlife Conservation Association. The male, Ping Ping, and the female, Fu Shuang, will take up residence at the Zoo Atlanta, which will become the third zoo in the United States to house the extremely popular foreign guests. The San Diego Zoo's Safari Park and the Smithsonian's National Zoo are the only other two spots in the entire United States who have been entrusted with panda bears. Specific departure dates have not yet been given, but the zoo is currently working on upgrades to their panda facility, and preparation work for the pandas' arrival is underway, according to the statement. On Thursday, Zoo Atlanta said that it was delighted and honored to be entrusted with the care of these two pandas. The zoo's president, Raymond B. King, stated, "We can't wait to meet Ping Ping and Fu Shuang and to welcome our members, guests, city, and community back to the wonder and joy of giant pandas." The zoo had a previous panda agreement with the China Wildlife Conservation Association between 1999 up through 2024, which resulted in a highly productive 25-years of partnership, during which time the pandas Lun Lun and Yang Yang gave birth to 7 cubs. They returned to China once the partnership had concluded. America was briefly pandaless in 2024 when several agreements ended all at once, marking the first time that the USA has been without any pandas in the 50 years that have gone by since the first pair arrived in 1972. China loans its pandas to foreign nations to strengthen its relationships abroad. The animals are typically sent back when the agreement ends. Panda diplomacy, as it is commonly referred to, has been practiced ever since the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, and it can equally be used to show that nation's negative feelings towards another country as well. In 2010, China recalled 2 pandas from Zoo Atlanta after their warnings about a meeting between Barack Obama and the Dalai Lama did not go the way that they hoped. Though there was no formal statement on the matter, there was much speculation that the timing reflected Beijing's displeasure with Washington. So, conversely, this event potentially signals a desire for friendlier relations. That is it for me this week. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, I would ask you to please help me build this podcast into a success by clicking the like and follow buttons, because that is what does the trick in making these things successful, and it doesn't cost anything to do. And I hope you come back again next week. Until then, have a good week, my friends.